And aloha and welcome everyone on behalf of the Grassroots Institute to our online seminar. Today's March 24th, 2020, and I'm Keli'i Akina, as Joe said, president of the Institute. And we're very pleased to have with us today Jacob Vigdor, whom I'll introduce to you soon. But first, let me thank you all for joining us. And more than that, at the Grassroots Institute, we care deeply about your health and safety during these extraordinary times. I'm very pleased that in the audience today, we have with us Professor Ken Skulland of Hawaii Pacific University and his students. Thanks for joining us, Ken. Professor Kate Joe of the University of Hawaii and her students. Professor Gail Pooley from Brigham Young University and his students. Welcome to all of you. And an old friend, Keali'i Mossman, a teacher at Kamehameha Schools Maui, whose students in the Business and Leadership Academy are joining us today. Thank you for joining us. And friends and supporters of the Grassroots Institute, we're glad that you're here with us today. Here's today's topic. Is Seattle a warning against Hawaii raising its minimum wage? Now, you may be wondering why in the midst of this coronavirus, we're focusing on a public policy issue that seems possibly at this time very remote. Well, the answer is simple. We're going to come through this crisis, and we will then need to be able to rebuild our economy and our government functions. So in addition to dealing with immediate needs, now is the time to prepare for long-term solutions. Would you agree? And those long-term public policy solutions might actually emerge right now in the crisis. For example, Grassroots Institute has documented the consequences of, well, for a long time, the ongoing exodus of Hawaii's population due to government economic policy. And one of the consequences of this has been a shortage of doctors. Now, the immediate crisis out of necessity has brought with it what I would call a silver lining, the loosening of regulations against telemedicine and out-of-state doctors practicing in Hawaii. Now, our political leaders would do well to continue relieving us from such burdensome regulation even after the current crisis passes. Now, in the same vein, now is not the time to raise our mandated minimum wage laws, especially given the impact emergency decrees have had upon our businesses. They'll soon need all the relief they can get from government regulation just in order to survive and to provide much needed jobs to those in need. My guest today is a new friend whom I've gotten to know through interviews and through sharing research, Jacob Vigdor. He's a professor at the University of Washington Evans School of Public Policy and Governance, and he holds affiliations as a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. He's an adjunct fellow at the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research and an external fellow at the Center for Research and Analysis of Migration at the University College in London. Now, you may know Professor Vigdor as the director of the Seattle Minimum Wage Study back in 2014, or actually it began in 2014 and it continues to this day. And that was when that city, Seattle, was the first big city in the United States to start raising its minimum wage systematically over a period of several years to $15 an hour. Now, Vigdor and his colleagues conducted a comprehensive analysis of the city's new wage structure and its possible effects on the economy. I think you're going to find what Vigdor has to say very fascinating. And what I'd like to do today is give Jacob half an hour in order to give his presentation. And during that time, we'd love to collect your questions. If you take a look at the bottom of the screen, there's a little link to being able to chat or to offer a question. If you do that, we'll collect them, and Joe Kent at the end will come back and field those questions to Jacob. But in the meantime, please welcome with me now Professor Jacob Vigdor. Jacob, welcome to Grassroots Institute again. Glad to have you on board.
Thank you, Keli'i. It's a pleasure to be here. It might have been even a more of a pleasure to meet with you in person, seeing that outside in Seattle today, it's probably in the 40s and cloudy, and it's been this way for a long time. But the things being the way they are.
Jacob, we're sorry we can't have you in here in Hawaii in person, and so we'll have you come out in the future. But in the meantime, tell us just briefly how you're weathering the lockdown in Seattle before we get started.
Well, Governor Inslee just gave us the order yesterday that we are supposed to stay home, not leave the house except to seek medical care or to get groceries or take out food. So our family's doing well. we do think a lot about a lot of other families that have seen much more economic disruption in their lives because they no longer have jobs to go to, that sort of thing. But on a personal level, we're all doing very well. Thank you for asking.
Well, I'm just going to let you take it away now, and then when you're done, we'll have questions for you. All right?
That sounds perfect. Well, thank you all for listening to the little talk today. I am going to go ahead and start up a little slideshow with you now that is going to show you some of the evidence that we collected in Seattle about the city's experience with the minimum wage between 2014. The data I'm going to show you today more or less span the time period going up to 2016, and I'll have a chance to tell you why we think that's the most interesting period of time to look at. But what we're analyzing with our work is a period that started when the city chose to raise the minimum wage in June of 2014. This is a picture of Seattle's Mayor Ed Murray. He is signing the legislation that raised the minimum wage. $15 an hour was the battle cry for advocates, but it actually was a policy that took a little while to phase in. So what you see here, the city wanted to advertise a $15 minimum wage, but starting from 2014, it was going to take a period of years to get there. And the phase-in schedule was different for employers of different sizes and for workers depending on whether they received health benefits or tips. So the largest employers were in a situation where they were expected to raise the minimum wage to $15 by 2017. Some of the smaller businesses in Seattle here in 2020 are still on the path up to $15 an hour, but today most of the businesses are at $15 an hour or even higher than that. The minimum wage is indexed to inflation here in Seattle, so we are continuing to see increases year over year. I think we're up to about $16.39 for the largest businesses in the city right now. So around the time the city chose to raise the minimum wage, the city sought a contract with academic researchers who would study the effects of the policy. And so along with some colleagues here at the University of Washington, we submitted a bid to get that contract, and we were the only bidder. And so that led us on this little journey that led us to do all sorts of different things. We surveyed employers. We went out into the Seattle Business License Directory and collected a sample of businesses and went and asked them questions about how much they knew about the law, what they thought was going to happen as a consequence of the minimum wage increase. We went and we found workers to talk to. We tried to find workers who sort of typified the sorts of employees that minimum wage advocates are really seeking to help. Parents trying to raise kids on the basis of low wage work. And we went to their homes and we visited them repeatedly over a 3-year period and spent sometimes 60 to 90 minutes talking to them about what their experiences were. We sent research assistants out in the streets and onto the internet to collect data on prices to figure out whether businesses were passing along cost increases to their customers. And we also analyzed some data, but before we get to the data, which is the really interesting part of this, I'll just sort of show you some of the highlights from some of the survey research that we did. We found that most employers said the minimum wage was going to lead them to raise wages, which is sort of what the authors of this law intended. But we also saw that employers were citing a lot of different strategies for potentially dealing with the minimum wage increase, and that would include things like reducing the number of people, I don't want to get ahead of myself here. Reducing the number of people on staff, raising prices or adding service charges, limiting fringe benefits. Some of them told us that they would consider taking their business out of Seattle or contracting out work so they didn't have to pay the minimum wage. So these are the things that businesses were telling us back in 2015, right when the minimum wage was about to increase. When we went and talked to workers, here's some characteristics of the people that we found working low-wage jobs in the city of Seattle. Many of them are immigrants. A lot of them are working part-time, but about half were working full-time or more. We're looking for people who are raising kids, so that led us to an 80% female workforce with kids. They were earning an average of $11.83 an hour when we first talked to them. This is at a period of time when the minimum wage is only $9.47 an hour. So a lot of these workers were earning more than the minimum, and that's an important thing to bear in mind. in the city of Seattle, that first minimum wage increase might not have mattered as much because there were not very many workers earning that minimum wage. And what we saw, these workers, their life of work was kind of unstable. Between the first time that we talked to them and the second time we talked to them, about a year later, about 22% of them had been unemployed for some length of time. And this is in a period of time where the city's economy overall is booming. But for these workers, the risk of a layoff or unemployment is hard to avoid. What we discovered in talking to folks, I mentioned a little while ago that this is a complicated law. It phased in the minimum wage at different rates for businesses of different sizes. Not a whole lot of people understood the way the minimum wage policy worked. One of the things that we noticed was only about 29% of the workers that we talked to could explain to us the details of the minimum wage policy. Amongst the immigrants in our sample, only 9% could. And this had implications in terms of enforcement of the minimum wage policy. The city was relying on workers to blow the whistle on their employers. But what we learned was the workers didn't have enough knowledge to really know whether they were being paid the right minimum wage or not. And most of the calls that the city of Seattle got asking about the minimum wage were not from workers. They were from businesses who were facing a lot of confusion and uncertainty regarding what the law actually meant for them. So when we did talk to workers, a lot of them told us that they thought that it was a good idea to raise wages. They would tell us it's a great idea. They thought that it would affect them positively. But at the same time, they also told us things that worried them. They thought that a higher minimum wage was going to lead to price increases. They thought that a higher minimum wage would lead their employers to cut back on fringe benefits. And a lot of them were receiving public benefits. They were receiving food assistance, SNAP benefits. They were living in subsidized housing. And if that wage goes up, they're going to see the value of their benefits go down. They're facing high tax rates because they receive these benefits. So a lot of them expressed some skepticism that a higher wage was really going to help them a lot. So this is all information that we had gathered before we really had a chance to dig into data about what was going on in the labor market. So let me take a few minutes now to walk you through the data that we had available to really do an in-depth study of what was going on as the city raised the minimum wage. So we got data from Washington's Employment Security Department. Every 3 months, businesses are required to file a report with the Employment Security Department listing all their employees, how much they were paid, and how many hours they worked. And this was really useful information for us. So we had names and social security numbers of basically every person working for pay in the state of Washington. We could track down where these employers were, whether they were in the city of Seattle or not, in most cases. Washington is one of only 4 states that collects that hours data. So the hours data was really helpful for us to understand not just are people staying on the job, but are they having their hours cut back? And so what we did with the data is that we looked at patterns in the city of Seattle, and then we compared the evolution of employment and wages in Seattle to what we call synthetic Seattle. And that's just areas of Washington state outside the city that we could use as what we call a control group. So these are places where the minimum wage stayed the same. It gave us some idea of what we might have expected to happen if the city had left the minimum wage alone. So let's show you the results. So these graphs that I'm showing you have a black line and a blue line. The black line tracks what happens in Seattle, and the blue line tracks what's happening in the other parts of Washington state. So what you see here, we have time going back to about 2006 or so. And the minimum wage is not actually passed in Seattle until 2014. It doesn't go into effect until 2015. So what you see in the left-hand part of this graph is that Seattle and the surrounding areas track each other pretty well. We're looking at wages right now. So we're seeing what's happening to trends in wages in Seattle versus other parts of Washington state. We see that wages kind of dip coming out of the recession, and then they start up on an increasing trend again. The minimum wage gets passed in 2014. Seattle and the rest of Washington state continue to track each other pretty closely. These blue and black lines are really close together. As soon as the minimum wage goes up, these black lines and blue lines separate. And what we see is that the wages are going up a lot faster in the city of Seattle than they are in the rest of Washington state after tracking each other so closely for the previous 10 years. So that really gives us a lot of confidence in saying, well, yes, indeed, when the minimum wage went up, wages went up. This part of our study was not controversial at all. That's what everyone was hoping to happen when the minimum wage goes up, that people earn higher wages if they're working. But then the next question is, do people keep their jobs? Are they still working? And this is where the findings got a little bit more controversial. So this next graph is really similar, except instead of tracking wages, we're tracking the total number of hours that are being worked for low wages in the city of Seattle and in the remainder of Washington state. And once again, we've got a black line and a blue line. And once again, these two lines track each other pretty closely for a period of 10 years or so. Hours worked really takes a hit during the recession back around 2008, 2009. They bounce back and they track each other pretty well. The city passes the policy. Hours worked continue to track each other's track pretty well, depending on whether you're in Seattle or the rest of Washington state. And then you start to see the separation happen right when the minimum wage starts getting phased in. And so here, the blue line is ahead of the black line. And so what this blue line is showing us is that the labor market continued to grow in Washington state outside of Seattle once the minimum wage gets phased in. But in Seattle, what had been a period of pretty decent growth in the low-wage labor market turns into a period where the labor market shrinks. And that shrinking gets worse and worse the further along we go in time. So our bottom line conclusion was, hey, the minimum wage increasing, it caused people's hourly wages to go up by about 3%, but it caused the total number of hours worked to decline by about 9%. So if you just stop and think about that for a minute, if I raise your hourly rate by 3%, but then I cut your hours by 9%, you're actually not any better off. You're going to be taking home less pay than you would have otherwise. So that was a finding that really made a lot of waves here in Seattle and across the country in terms of suggesting that, hey, maybe this minimum wage increase is not really accomplishing what we wanted it to do. We took one more cut at the data, though, to really get a much deeper understanding of what's going on. So the graphs that I just showed you are really just tracking what's going on in the labor market as a whole. We can use our data not just to track the labor market as a whole, but to track what's happening to individual workers. And we can trace them by the thousands, by the tens of thousands. So the next analysis that we did was to try to see, well, what happens to individual people who had low-wage jobs in Seattle, the minimum wage goes up, what's their experience like? What happens to their wages? What happens to their employment? What happens to their hours? Now, it's important when we move to this part of the analysis, if you didn't have a job to start, you don't count in this analysis. And that's going to be really important as we move forward with this. So with that in mind, let me show you a couple more graphs. So here's one of them. This is showing us what's happening to workers who had a lot of labor market experience at the time the minimum wage went up. We're starting from before the minimum wage goes up, and we're tracing forward what's happening to their hourly wages. That's this purple line on top. Their hourly wages are increasing, and they increase more as time goes on. This line down at the bottom is tracing what's happening to their hours. So as their wages are going up, their hours are being cut back a little bit. These experienced workers are seeing their hours go down by somewhere around 5%, where their wages are going up 15%. So if your wage goes up 15% and your hours are only cut 5%, then you come out a little ahead. We're finding that these workers are seeing their paychecks go up by somewhere in the 5 to 10% range, which is good for them. Another thing, there's a line here that you can barely see, and it's really flat, and it stays right along here, and that's their probability of remaining employed. What we found here in Seattle is that these experienced workers were not losing their jobs. We found that these workers were having their hours cut back. So your experience as a low-wage worker is not necessarily going to be that you get fired when the minimum wage goes up. You're just going to discover that your part-time job has fewer hours than it used to have. This is the experience that we traced for experienced workers. let me show you what happens if you're a less experienced worker. So suppose that you had a job at the beginning of 2015, but you were one of the last people hired before the minimum wage goes up. What happens to you? This second graph shows us the experience of these other types of workers. So they are experiencing wage increases. So we see this purple line on top. It's up, it gets higher over time. We're seeing the hourly wage for these workers go up by 10% or more. But their hours are being cut back much more sharply. Instead of losing about 5% of their hours, to start out, they're losing 15% of their hours. And that recovers a little bit over time, but as far forward as we can track them, they're still losing about 10% of their hours. So your wage goes up 10%, your hours get cut back 10%. That's going to leave you in about a break-even situation. And that's about the best case scenario for these less experienced workers. What's happening to them, they're actually seeing their paychecks go down. There's maybe a little bit recovery after a year or so because they're getting more experience on the job. But the hours cutbacks are more severe for them. So we're seeing that our more experienced workers, they're coming out ahead to some extent. The less experienced workers are breaking even. But there's another component of the workforce that we have to talk about. It's the people who didn't yet have jobs when the minimum wage went up. They are the workers who had the hardest time as a result of this policy change. This last graph I'm going to show you is tracing with black and blue lines, again, what's happening in Seattle and the rest of Washington State in terms of the number of new people entering the workforce. Now, in the time period we're looking at, that goes from about 2011 forward, the labor market is growing. There are more people entering the workforce all the time. This line is sloping upwards. But then what you see happening once Seattle starts raising the minimum wage and the rest of the Washington State, we still see more and more workers entering the labor force. But in Seattle, that stagnates. So if you're a person who didn't have a job when the minimum wage went up, it became harder to find one. And that is really the big takeaway message that we had from trying to unpack the data a little bit more this way. Hey, for your experienced workers, minimum wage goes up. Employers tell us, look, if I'm going to hire somebody to work for $15 an hour, I want somebody who knows how to do this job. I don't want to have to train someone. My experienced workers are more valuable to me now. But if you're at the other end of that spectrum, if you're trying to break into the labor force and get that first job, you're going to discover it's harder because the employers don't want to hire you. They would much prefer to hire someone they don't have to train, someone who has references that they can check. And that's the way we see things playing out in Seattle. So we went back to our workers a couple years into this project and tried to catch up with them and see what was going on. See if the minimum wage had really caused a big difference in their lives. And nobody was upset about getting a higher hourly wage, but they did tell us a few cautionary things about how raising the minimum wage still left them with a lot of difficulty in terms of making ends meet. Everybody that I know is doing multiple things. They're really hustling to be able to get by. So I don't have to say it, Seattle's a really expensive place to live. And if all you have is a low-wage job, it's really hard to make ends meet. But what we're discovering in the data and what people are telling us is that raising people's hourly wage in a world where they're potentially going to see their hours cut back as a consequence, we're not necessarily making it any easier for them to make ends meet. And a lot of people are looking around Seattle, they see it's a prosperous place, but they're seeing the rents go up, they're seeing the cost of living go up, and they're realizing that, look, I don't know if there's a place for me in this city anymore. And the minimum wage isn't really addressing that problem. And what we heard from some of these folks is that, hey, I'm still here, but I know a lot of people that are giving up, that it's so hard to make ends meet in this expensive place that your best play is to leave town. And one of the interesting data points that we picked up, the state of Idaho for many years was a place that people left to come to Seattle. So if you go to the Idaho Department of Motor Vehicles, they have data on how many Idaho licenses are traded in for Washington licenses and vice versa. For many, many years, people were turning in their Idaho driver's licenses to get their Washington driver's licenses because Seattle was this place where the jobs were. What we see happening in the most recent data is that pattern has reversed. Now people from Washington are moving to Idaho, Why is it? Because they can't keep up with the cost of living. They are, sick of the conditions as they are in Seattle, and the minimum wage was not enough to solve that problem. And so that's, it really creates a little bit of a conundrum. If your goal is to lift up the working poor, which is what minimum wage advocates will tell you they're trying to do, the minimum wage doesn't look like it's really successful at accomplishing that. And so it does lead to this question. So what do you want to do? And rather than tell you that I've got the answer to this question, my message is this is what we need to talk about. So that's all I've really got to say in terms of my prepared remarks. I see that there have been a couple of comments come in on chat, and I'm happy to continue the conversation.
Thank you, Jacob. I appreciate your presentation, and we do have some questions that have come in. But first, let me ask you this. As you take a look at the data that you have presented, it appears that obviously not everyone is hurt by increases in minimum wage. In fact, some individuals actually benefit from that. I like that point because you have a very well-balanced analysis. But nonetheless, what you have pointed out is that there are those at the lower end of the economic ladder, particularly those who are without jobs, who need jobs, who are entering the job force, who are inordinately hurt and impacted by minimum wage increases. Would you say that's the case, that those at the lower end of the economic ladder are the most hurt by minimum wage increases?
I'd say, yeah, what the data show are pretty clear that if you were just trying to break into the labor market and get that first job, maybe you're a college student trying to support yourself, or maybe you're just sort of starting out. You're just looking for the first rung on the ladder. That the minimum wage increase has sort of taken away that first rung on the ladder, and that does make it more difficult for people. But it's not. What I tell people is that the minimum wage is not a win-win. It's not a lose-lose. It's a win-lose. So yeah. Absolutely. There are going to be some people in the economy who are seeing their paycheck go up as a result of this. But then you're going to have some other people in the economy that don't get a paycheck at all as a result of this. And you really got to ask some careful questions about, well, hey, look, if we've got this kind of trade-off, is this a trade-off that we're comfortable with? Or is there another thing that we could do that would deliver help to the people who really need it without taking away this bottom rung for upwardly mobile young workers who are just trying to get that experience that will help launch them into a higher paying job?
Now, for our viewers, I want to encourage you to go to your chat button at the bottom of the screen and ask Jacob a question. We're going to get to you right away, but one more question from me, and then we'll get to our viewers' questions. Jacob, you and I have talked about the situation in Hawaii, and for a long time we have seen a low level of unemployment in Hawaii. But as you point out, that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody is happy, because it could be that there are a great many people who are just underemployed, who have to work perhaps several jobs and don't earn the kind of living that they need to earn. On a general level, how does your research and the experience in Seattle apply to what you know about Hawaii? And what lessons could Hawaii learn?
Well, there's one big difference between Seattle and Hawaii, which is one thing that we heard from business owners was to say, well, look, we don't like paying higher wages in Seattle. So what we're going to do is we're going to just move right outside the city limits. We'll just move out to the suburbs where the minimum wage is lower. If you're in Hawaii, it's a little bit harder to just move right across the state line and set up your operation there. So Seattle and Hawaii are not necessarily comparable in that way, but there's another respect in which you can really draw a lot of parallels between the labor markets, which is to say, a lot of low-wage work is part-time work. And so everybody has to remember that the amount of your paycheck, it's not just a function of what your hourly rate is, it's a function of what your hours are. And I think that one of the things that's important to keep in mind is that for people who are trying to make ends meet on the basis of this kind of work, wages are not, they're not even half the battle. It's hours. And the challenge that you find in a lot of these low wage labor markets is that, you raise the wage, the hours go down. This might have only been a 20-hour a week job to start with. And it's going to be a really rare job that only gives you 20 hours a week and gives you enough to live on. So This is one of the general challenges that you face. These jobs, in a lot of cases, they're not the kind of jobs that can offer full-time hours. And so you have to ask the question, okay, um, if we have a problem that people are trying to make ends meet on the basis of this kind of work, can we imagine policies that would steer those workers to a different kind of job that has more stable hours? It's not just a function of the wages, it's a function of the hours. You're always going to have people like college students or people who families that have one full-time income and they're just looking for a part-time job on the side. The part-time labor market serves a purpose in the economy. But that purpose is not to give people who have no other income a solid source of support for themselves. Figuring that out is a challenge both in Hawaii and Seattle.
Well, thank you, and thanks for making the comparison and contrast between Hawaii and Seattle. It is correct that we can't get into a car and drive to the next state, but unfortunately, at Grassroots Institute, we have been tracking a large exodus of our population that are leaving anyway, taking the planes to get to Nevada and Florida and elsewhere. But we're going to go now to questions that have started coming in. And I want to remind you, everybody, at the bottom of your screen, there's a chat button. You can ask questions. We welcome them at this time. Joe Kent, what are the questions we have standing by?
Yes, well, we have some great questions. One is from, let's see, Terry. Terry asks, can Jacob explain the difference between buying power versus having more money?
Buying power versus having more money. Well, the difference between those two concepts is prices. One of the things that we heard from our workers in Seattle was a concern that more money was not going to mean more buying power because everything would go up, prices would go up. People were worried about the rent going up. People were worried about grocery prices going up. People were worried about the price of gas. The things that they end up spending a lot of money on, they were worried about those things getting more expensive. The efforts that we made to try to understand what was happening in prices to Seattle suggested that the minimum wage really had the biggest impact on prices in one industry, and that's the restaurant industry, where there's a lot of labor that goes into preparing and serving food to people. There's not necessarily a lot of labor involved in, say, pumping gas. And if there is labor, it's your own in a lot of cases. So that was definitely a significant concern that we heard a lot about in talking to workers here in Seattle, which is, hey, more money is great, but if the deal is I get more money, but then I have to pay more money for everything, I don't think I'm better off.
Okay, another question from Nicole. She asks, if wages were going up in Seattle due to the booming economy, then would that also cause the number of low-wage jobs to drop? And in that case, wouldn't that be that wouldn't be a bad thing?
Yeah, the way that we tried to deal with that, in those graphs that I showed you, there was a black line and a blue line. And the whole idea is that Seattle's labor market is booming, but in the remainder of Washington state, there's a lot of boom happening as well. So anything that we think is happening because of this background stuff, like the tech boom in the Seattle region, that's what our methods are designed to try to filter out by doing the comparison of what's happening in Seattle to what's happening in the surrounding area.
Lee has a question. She says, some people argue that getting a higher wage with the accompanying lower hours is a good thing because you have time to spend with family, or you could get maybe a better second job to fill in the gap. But do you have any data on employee well-being after their wages go up and hours go down?
The best data that we have on well-being comes from our efforts to actually go into people's homes and talk to them. And the overwhelming message that we got from going into people's homes and talking about their experiences was the sense that it goes back to this question of pay versus purchasing power, that they felt like they could see the impact of the higher wage on their paycheck, but then there was no impact of the higher minimum wage on their bank account, because whatever extra money they made was going right out the door to cover higher rent, to cover higher food costs. So from that perspective, we have no evidence to suggest that the higher minimum wage turned Seattle into a worker's paradise. The cost of living is just really preventing that from happening. Now, to go back to this question, if I keep your paycheck the same, but you can earn that same amount of pay in a shorter number of hours, I think, we do think that that's a good thing. And there were definitely some of the workers that we talked to that expressed, some relief that now, these are people that might have been working 16-hour days and they were leaving the house before their kids got up and getting home after they went to bed. And it was giving them the chance to actually be with their families. And undeniably, that's a good thing. But for every worker that we talked to like that, we had other workers for whom they were struggling to get hours in the first place. If I'm giving you 20 hours a week and it's not enough for you to get by, and then I say, I'll make you a deal. I'll give you the same amount of money for 18 hours a week instead of 20. And so you have 2 extra hours to do whatever you want. If you were not getting enough money to live on in the first place, it doesn't sound like such a great deal. I mean, yeah, it's great to have 2 extra hours, but if you are on the brink of starvation and if you are on the brink of being thrown out on the street because you can't pay the rent, you're not looking for a deal that gives you the same money with fewer hours. You're looking for more money.
Okay, Russell Pearson says, wouldn't raising the minimum wage just raise prices on everything, basically? And that would kind of screw people over who are living paycheck to paycheck because everybody would charge more.
Definitely a concern that we heard. And when we looked at the price data that we collected, we could see that in the restaurant industry. When you buy a meal at a restaurant, about $1 out of every 3 is going to pay for labor. It's the people who are cooking the food for you, the people who are taking your order. If you're on a full service restaurant, it's the people bringing the food to your table, bussing your table when you're through. So there's a lot of labor that goes into that meal. If you don't eat at restaurants and you just buy the food at grocery stores, there's still some workers at grocery stores, but the cost of labor is a much smaller proportion of the cost of the food that you buy. We actually did a lot of price data collection in grocery stores as well as restaurants, and we didn't find any evidence that grocery prices in Seattle went up. So if you were worried about the price increases, there were certain things that you could do to avoid them, such as buy food at the grocery store and cook at home and don't eat at restaurants. And that's, in a lot of cases with people facing this rising cost of living, that is the sort of decision that they would have to make.
Okay, well, there's a lot of questions rolling in, so I'll try to get to them, but keep on asking. I really appreciate all these questions. Mark Boniscalco asks, how is the Berkeley study on Seattle's minimum wage different from your study?
Great question. So the Berkeley study, for those who are not aware of this, we released our main findings back in the summer of 2017, at the end of June. And we were working under contract with the city of Seattle, and we tried, one of the things that Seattle tried to do in managing our study was to say, don't give us any surprises. If you're going to be releasing something in the public, we want to have a little bit of an advance notice. And we thought that was fair. So we went to the city of Seattle, to the mayor's office in May, and said, hey, at the end of next month, we're going to be releasing this study, and here's what it's going to say. And so 1 week before we released our study, the mayor's office, now mind you, the mayor was up for re-election this year. And he was going to run for re-election, and what was his signature achievement? Raising the minimum wage. And here we were going to be coming out with this study that said that the mayor's signature achievement was maybe not working out so well. So the week before we released ours, the mayor's office put out this study written by some authors down at Berkeley. And here's what the Berkeley study found. The Berkeley study found that Seattle's minimum wage increase had not impacted employment in the restaurant industry. So the difference between the Berkeley study and our study, the Berkeley study was looking at employment in the restaurant industry, and it's looking only at the number of jobs, and it's not looking at hours. Our study is looking at low-wage work all throughout the economy, and there are just as many low-wage workers in the healthcare industry as in the restaurant industry. And instead of just counting the number of jobs, we're counting hours. And instead of looking at all jobs, we're just looking at the jobs that pay lower wages. So fortunately, when our study came out, we had tried to do things the Berkeley way as well. And we got the same answer that the Berkeley people did. So I have no issue with the conclusion that they reached, that Seattle's restaurant industry as a whole was doing fine. But the issue that I have with it is the rest of Seattle's low-wage labor market was not doing so fine. And if you looked at hours instead of just how many people have jobs, that's where you see the impact. And it goes back to something that we found tracing workers. It was not necessarily that they were getting fired, they were having their hours cut back. And the Berkeley study was incapable of looking at hours because it wasn't in their data.
So yours was a broader study then.
We had access to a better data resource, and we had the Employment Security Department gave us access to those data because the University of Washington is a state agency. And state agencies by law are allowed to share data with each other. But the Berkeley folks, because Berkeley is not an agency of the state of Washington, they were denied access to our data.
A question from Professor Ken Schoolin from Hawaii Pacific University. He asks, wouldn't raising the minimum wage hasten the shift to automation? And how much more would that shift to automation, if you raise the minimum wage, basically?
Yeah, so it's interesting. When we talk to employers about their reactions to this, automation was a little bit further down their list. Automation typically requires a little bit of upfront investment. So the story that you're likely to hear is say, oh, if you go to Wendy's, instead of ordering at the counter, you're going to order at a kiosk. Well, one of the things we heard from employers is, well, I got a few other tricks up my sleeve before we go to trying to put in kiosks. Instead of having a prep cook chop vegetables in my kitchen, I'll order chopped vegetables. Instead of having someone on my staff bus people's tables, I'll ask people to bus their own tables. That's just sort of shifting work from people on my payroll to people who are not on my payroll. The other thing that's happening with automation is that, if Wendy's goes and buys a kiosk and then some kid dumps a soda on the kiosk, well, then that's, the employer has to pay to fix the kiosk. What the employers are doing instead is that they're shifting to the objects like this one, right? Which basically all their customers are carrying around right now. They don't have to make any upfront investment in equipment. And typically when I give talks like this, I ask people, so does anybody here have the Starbucks app on their phone? And typically a lot of people do. And then I ask them, how do you like that Starbucks app? And the user satisfaction with the Starbucks app seems to be pretty high wherever I go. That Starbucks app is labor saving for Starbucks. What that means is that people are placing their orders on the app, and they're paying on the app. So they no longer need someone on their payroll to take the order or to handle the transaction. And all they need is someone to actually pour the coffee. And that's something that maybe they could automate as well going down the road. So technology is changing, and so absolutely, when you have higher costs for labor, it's going to increase the incentive for business owners to do things like develop an app, so that instead of having someone on payroll handle the credit card transaction and things, you just have your customers taking care of business with a piece of equipment that the business owner doesn't have to maintain and has no liability for it.
Jacob, we've got a few more questions for you. It's 12:43 right now. But first, I'd like to share a couple of things with everybody here. If you take a look at the screen right now, I hope you can see my screen. I've got the Grassroots Institute website up here. Hopefully you can see that.
Let's see. We actually can't see that on your screen. Maybe I can show it on my screen though.
You know what we'll do is we'll let you go ahead with the next question, and then I'll come back in a few minutes. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. All right. Well, the next question is from Ka Lam Leong, and she's asking if when low-income workers suddenly had a wage increase, did their government-funded benefits get slashed?
Short answer, If you were a worker receiving benefits, then absolutely, the increase in income means a reduction in benefits. And for a lot of programs, that's a reduction of 30 cents on the dollar, meaning that your paycheck goes up by $1, your food stamp benefits go down by 30 cents. If you're receiving something like a Section 8 housing voucher, the value of that voucher goes down by 30 cents on the dollar. So those reductions in income really reduce the extent to which this higher income translates into higher purchasing power.
Okay, Lee, it looks like we can see your screen now.
Very good. Okay. And you can take a look at the Grassroots Institute screen. Joe, can everybody see that?
Yep.
And I just wanted to point out a couple of things. First of all, if you go to grassrootsinstitute.org, which is right up over here, you can see our website name. There's a great article called How to Navigate the Coronavirus Recession by Joe Kent that was published in the Star Advertiser. I think you're going to find it interesting. In addition to that, take a look at some videos we have for you, one with Professor Ken Scullin and one where I interview an expert from Hong Kong. Those are available right now for you at the Grassroots Institute. Back to Joe, and we'll take some more questions.
Sure. Mark asks, what would you advise Hawaii lawmakers who are considering increasing our state's minimum wage to $13 an hour while coupling that with the earned income tax credit?
Well, there are a lot of economists who will tell you that the earned income tax credit makes more sense than a minimum wage increase. And the reason is an earned income tax credit targets assistance at the people who really are trying to make ends meet on the basis of their work. It's not going to give higher earnings to, say, teenagers who are living with two parents and two parents have jobs and the family's got a decent income. It's targeting assistance to the people whose family incomes are actually kind of low. So that, if you look across the political spectrum from left to right, you're going to find a lot of economists who reach the conclusion that the EITC is a better policy choice. I think that, any kind of advice that I'd be giving today has got to be like looking at what's happening to our economy right now in terms of coronavirus. I think in a world where everybody has a job, everybody wants a higher wage. If in a world where nobody has a job, the first thing that you want is a job. So I think that we're entering a period of time where there's going to be a lot of uncertainty. How long is these sectors of the economy that are being shut down? How long are they going to be shut down? How long is it going to take to get back up on your feet? In a place like Hawaii, where you've got a big tourism-based economy, how long is it going to take for the tourists to come back? How long before the restaurants and the hospitality industry is going to be hiring again? I think one of the things that we learn is, from looking at this higher minimum wage, when the minimum wage is higher and you're running a business that all of a sudden takes a big hit, like a hotel where the occupancy rate has plummeted, a restaurant where you don't have customers to serve anymore, your need to pare back your workforce is a lot stronger. And so I think that you want to be making policy today that is a little bit cognizant of the unusual circumstances we find ourselves in today. For the long haul, a policy like the earned income tax credit is going to have certain advantages. It doesn't put the same kind of burden on employers as a higher minimum wage does, and it doesn't necessarily have the same negative implications for workers in terms of seeing their hours cut back.
Okay. Another question, a similar current events type thing about what's happening right now. If everybody got $1,000 a month, then wouldn't that be similar to the minimum wage? And does your study, can your study be applied to that concept? I guess it's kind of a universal basic income concept too.
Yeah. Well, there's not too much that our study can talk about a universal basic income because Seattle didn't try one and there wasn't one going on. If you think about a universal basic income of $1,000 a month, if you're trying to raise a family and if you're in a high cost of living area, $1,000 a month is not going to be enough to live on. So it's, people are still going to have to work. What you could potentially prevent is the kind of situation where people face really big problems if they lose a job, if they're temporarily unemployed. That guaranteed income coming in could help them out through those difficult times. And I think one of the challenges we heard about in talking to families trying to make ends meet on the basis of low wage employment, they don't have savings. If their employer shuts down, and if you're in a low wage industry, restaurants close all the time. And it's not necessarily the workers' fault. I mean, it's just a tough business model. In a situation like that, it gives people a little bit more security to say, look, in a difficult time period, you're going to have something to fall back on, help you from falling too far down, so that you can get yourself back up on your feet, go out there and sort of look for a good job and try to get yourself, self-sufficient again.
Okay, a quick question. Did you actually measure how many businesses actually left the city, or just how many said they were going to leave the city?
Oh, we did not follow up with those businesses and ask the question, okay, did you leave or not? It was about 11% of businesses in that initial survey that said they're thinking about it.
Oh, I see.
So if 11% say they're thinking about it, what percent do you think are actually going to do it? We heard some stories. So there's some businesses that are footloose and some businesses that are not. If you got a catering company and you prepare a lot of your food in a commissary kitchen somewhere, it's real easy to move that commissary kitchen from inside the city limits to outside the city limits. And we did hear cases of that particular industry being shifting outside the city limits. Another case study that I heard about, manufacturing. So I heard from a manufacturer in Seattle and a maker of camping equipment. And this manufacturer, competitors are in China. And this manufacturer said, when I make my camping equipment, it's got a Made in the USA logo on it, and that's part of my brand. But I tell you what, Nevada's in the USA too. And in Nevada, my labor costs would be much lower, and I got to compete with China. And there's not much more I can because consumers might pay a little bit more for some equipment that's made in the USA, but not that much more. So if you're one of those competitive industries that's really got to keep a close eye on cost because you're facing international competition, then your reaction to a local minimum wage increase could be quite a bit stronger. Some of these other businesses that are in Seattle, some of the restaurants and things, they were less likely to really follow up on any kind of intention to move, because a lot of times these are neighborhood establishments. They're kind of, that's where they are. It's harder for them to just say, well, I'm going to move to some other place across the state where the labor costs are lower, but nobody knows who I am.
Okay, I have a kind of technical question here on the minimum wage from Laren, and he says, mahalos for the presentation. Can you speak to the lack of micro-level individual data in evaluating these macro questions? And he goes on to say, our state economic agency recently released a minimum wage study that ignored the fact that they replicated other minimum wage studies relying on industry level analysis. But that seems, he says, that seems irresponsible to ignore the lack of pre-treatment versus post-treatment populations. So it's a technical question. Basically, he's talking about a study that was released earlier in Hawaii.
Yeah. I generally would advise everyone to be skeptical of a study that is basically of the form, here's what we think is going to happen, regardless of what kind of data they've got. They're making guesses, and guesses are based on assumptions. And if you change your assumptions, you can arrive at very different guesses. There are a lot of places across the country that commission these studies that try to forecast, here's what we think will happen if we raise the minimum wage. And if you read the fine print on these studies, they basically start off by saying, okay, we're going to assume that the minimum wage doesn't cause a reduction in employment. And so here's our conclusion. Guess what? The minimum wage doesn't cause a reduction in employment. I mean, if you're paying attention, that's a conclusion that you reach because you assume the conclusion. If you start with a different assumption, you're going to reach a different conclusion. There's not really any substitute for just sort of looking at what happens after it actually happens when you've got actual data. So the issue that I have with a study that tries to make predictions like that, it's not necessarily, well, do you have data for individuals or just the entire economy? It's a question of, are you basing this on data at all, or are you just playing a little guessing game here? Because guessing games are only as good as the assumptions you build into them.
Well, Laren had a follow-up question here with this, and it's another technical question. He asked, since the EITC, which is the Earned Income Tax Credit, was brought up, wouldn't that and the minimum wage rest on two different assumptions? You mentioned, it depends on your assumptions. So, and the assumptions would be about the low wage labor demand elasticity. So the former, the EITC, is effective if the elasticity is high, but for there to be no adverse effects, the minimum wage then, the elasticity would have to be low. So he's talking about kind of a similar concept.
Yeah, so if you get into, like, if you want to do a little comparison, is this policy better or is that policy better under certain circumstances? This question about it's a technical term, right? The labor demand elasticity. It basically, to put that in sort of lay language, exactly how much do employers want to cut back on their staffing when they have to pay higher wages? And that is the question at the heart of this debate. And you've got a lot of people arguing that, hey, this elasticity is pretty low. You raise the wage and employers just throw up their hands and say, okay, I guess I'll pay the higher wage. But the evidence that we're picking up in Seattle says, well, hey, maybe they're keeping people on payroll, which is what a lot of these other studies are picking up, but they're keeping the people on payroll, but they're not getting the same hours that they used to. And so in a world where you have that sort of thing happening, the advantage of the EITC is that it doesn't require the employer to pay a higher wage. And so it's not going to lead to that reaction, that knee-jerk reaction of saying, okay, I'm going to try to get by. If I had 10 people working on this shift, I'm going to try to get by with 9, which is about the magnitude of the reduction of hours that we were seeing.
So they don't cancel each other out.
No.
Well, Joe and Jacob, we've got one last question before we close today, and I'm going to ask Jacob if you could answer it very quickly. Joe, would you give us Ken Scullin's final question?
Well, Professor Ken Scullin asked, can government gain more worker income by lowering taxes and regulations, for example, the Jones Act, instead of asking employers to raise wages?
So, of course, in some cases, that's the short answer. The Jones Act is coming up here in Seattle. In Seattle, we've got a tourism industry in the summer that involves cruise ships to Alaska. Now, those cruise ships to Alaska can only carry passengers if they make a stop in Canada, and it's because of the Jones Act. And Canada recently announced that they're shutting down the cruise season for Canada, which by default means that the Alaska cruise season for the Seattle economy is shut down as well. So in a situation like that, you definitely see how a regulation leads to a loss of income earning opportunities, and changing that regulation. And why is that regulation there? Is to protect a certain sector of the economy. But you're protecting one segment of the economy at the expense of another. And so rethinking some of that, if your goal is to deliver better opportunities to people in the low wage labor market, think about what are the regulations that you have that are benefiting one sector of the economy, but they're hurting the sectors that employ low wage people. And if you take a look at those and address those, then maybe you can turn some of those situations around.
Very good. Thank you, Jacob. And first of all, let me say thank you, Joe, for moderating the questions. Appreciate that tremendously. And to all of you who are with us today, we say aloha and mahalo to Jacob Vigdor, great expertise given to us. And we hope that you'll continue to do things with the Grassroots Institute. we're moving full steam ahead during this time. Fortunately, at the Grassroots Institute, we already work virtually, so this is very easy for us to bring people together. We're going to continue offering conferences and seminars, newsletters each week, our research papers, and if you're new to us, we're going to take your email that you gave today and put you on our newsletter list. And we hope that you'll enjoy receiving videos and updates on what's going on. Until next time, let me say aloha to each of you. There were 92 participants today, and 87 of you are still on board at the end of the hour. So I think that's a tribute to you, Jacob. Thank you very much for a great program. Until next time, I'm Keli'i Akina. On behalf of the Grassroots Institute, be safe, be healthy. Much aloha. Bye-bye.